Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Sophie adjusted her vintage earrings one more time. Watching her reflection in the boutique's antique mirror, the soft afternoon light filtering through the Brooklyn storefront created golden highlights in her reddish-brown hair, and for a moment, she felt beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made her think about James Carver's hands tracing her collarbone the night before. Her phone buzzed against the glass counter, displaying James Carver's name, and instantly her pulse quickened. He'd been on her mind all morning, especially after the way he whispered her name before leaving her apartment at dawn. Sophie looked around the empty boutique. Mrs. Lin was at lunch, and the next customer wasn't expected for another hour. Perfect timing. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced confidence, crafting words that would make him think about her for the rest of his workday. I can't stop thinking about last night. The way you touched me. I want to feel your hands on me again. Tonight I'm yours completely. No limits. Tell me what you want to do to me. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, that familiar rush of bold satisfaction warming her chest. Sophie had always been direct about what she wanted, and James Carver loved that about her, or at least, she hoped he loved it. But when she set the phone down, something felt off. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she should double-check, but she ignored it. She texted James Carver hundreds of times. She knew his number by heart, didn't she? Meanwhile, 30 floors above Manhattan, in a glass-walled office that looked out over the city like a throne, James Carver was reviewing quarterly reports when his phone chimed. He rarely received personal messages during business hours. His life was scheduled down to the minute, every interaction calculated and purposeful. The unknown number made him pause. James Carver didn't deal with unknown numbers. His assistant filtered everything. His contacts were vetted, and spontaneous communication was something he'd systematically eliminated from his existence. Yet, here was a message, bold and explicit, sitting on his screen like a challenge to his perfectly controlled world. He read it once, twice. The words were direct, provocative, and strangely refreshing. In his world of corporate speak and carefully constructed conversations, this raw honesty was almost shocking. James leaned back in his leather chair, the city sprawling below him like a chessboard. He'd built his empire by reading people, understanding what they wanted before they even knew it themselves. This message, it wasn't random. Someone was offering exactly what many women had offered him before, but with a refreshing lack of pretense. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Most men might simply ignore the message, maybe respond with wrong number. But James Carver wasn't most men. He was a businessman first, always. And this felt like business. Interesting proposition, he typed. 3,000 for 3 hours. My penthouse tomorrow at 7 p.m. Discreet, professional, no complications. Are you available? He hit send without hesitation. If this was what he thought it was, the transaction would be simple and straightforward. If it wasn't, he'd find out soon enough. Sophie's phone buzzed, just as she was helping a customer choose between 2 silk scarves. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop to her knees. The response wasn't from James Carver. It was from an unknown number, and the words made her hands shake. Just give me 1 second. She managed to tell the customer, positioning herself behind the counter with trembling fingers. She read the message again, each word hitting her like ice water. $3,000. Penthouse. Professional. The implication was crystal clear, and it was mortifying. Her fingers flew across the screen. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. That was meant for someone else. Completely wrong number. Please just delete that and pretend it never happened. The response came almost immediately. I understand. However, you presented an offer, and I made a counteroffer. Are you declining? Sophie stared at the phone, torn between horror and something else she couldn't name. There was something about the response, so controlled, so matter-of-fact, that intrigued her despite her embarrassment. I wasn't making an offer, she typed back. That message was private and personal, sent to the wrong person by mistake. Everything is business, Miss Sophie, came the reply. And no, not everything is business. Sophie, even in text, her name seemed to carry weight when he wrote it. I'm James Carver. And I disagree. You interrupted my afternoon with a rather vivid proposition. The least you could do is consider my response. She should have stopped there, should have apologized once more and blocked the number. But something about his directness, the way he seemed completely unfazed by her embarrassment, made her curious. Did you really think I was? She typed. then deleted it. Started again. Do you always respond to random messages by offering money? I respond to opportunities. You presented one. I evaluated it and made an offer. That's how business works. This isn't business. James Carver, this is my life you're talking about. Isn't everything a transaction, Sophie? Time, attention, affection, we all trade, something for something else. The customer cleared her throat, reminding Sophie where she was. She looked up to see the woman tapping her watch impatiently. I'll take both scarves, the customer announced, clearly irritated by the delay. While Sophie processed the sale, her phone kept buzzing with messages from James Carver. Each response was more intriguing than the last, each one pulling her deeper into a conversation she never meant to have. When the customer left, Sophie realized she'd been holding her breath. She looked down at her phone at this strange exchange with a man who spoke in absolutes and saw the world in terms of negotiations. Who was James Carver? And why couldn't she stop wanting to know what he'd say next? The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze for Sophie. Every time she tried to focus on organizing clothes or helping the occasional customers, her phone would buzz again. James Carver, that name was starting to echo in her mind, like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Are you still there, Sophie? The message appeared on her screen at 3:30. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sensible thing would be to block the number and move on with her life. But there was something magnetic about the way he wrote her name, as if it were an equation he was trying to solve. Unfortunately, yes, she replied. And are you still there making indecent proposals to strangers? Only to the interesting ones. Sophie felt heat rise up her neck. He had a way of turning every exchange into a game, and against her better judgment, she was enjoying playing. And what makes you think I'm interesting? You don't even know me. You're responding. The simplicity of the answer left her speechless for a moment. He was right. She was responding, participating in this strange dance, when she could simply ignore him. In his office, James Carver pushed the reports aside. Sophie had become more interesting than any financial projection. There was an authenticity in her responses that intrigued him. No elaborate games, no obvious attempts to impress him. She was direct, even when she was clearly out of her comfort zone. His assistant, Clara, appeared in the doorway with a stack of documents. Mr. Carver, the merger contracts are ready for review, and Senator Thompson confirmed dinner for Thursday. James waved distractedly, his eyes still glued to his phone. Cancel dinner with Thompson. Clara frowned. She'd worked for James Carver for 8 years and had never seen him cancel an important commitment on a whim. Sir, may I ask why? I have something more interesting to do on Thursday. When Clara left, clearly confused, James Carver turned his attention back to his phone. A new message from Sophie awaited him. All right, I'll bite. What makes a man like you, assuming you are who you say you are, respond to a message like that instead of just deleting it? James Carver smiled, a rare expression on his normally controlled face. Maybe I'm bored. How sad. A bored, powerful man is a dangerous man. Do you think I'm dangerous? There was a long pause before her response came. I'm starting to think you might be. Sophie closed the boutique at 6, but instead of heading straight home, she sat on the bench outside, unable to stop typing. The conversation had evolved into something she couldn't define, part provocation, part interrogation, part flirtation. Tell me about yourself, came James Carver's message. Is this part of your opportunity assessment? Pure curiosity. I'm 26, work at a boutique in Brooklyn, live alone in an apartment that would fit in your closet, and apparently have the bad habit of texting wrong numbers. And the man who was supposed to receive the original message? The question caught her off guard. She'd almost forgotten about Ethan amid this electrifying verbal exchange. It's complicated, she typed. Most interesting things are, what about you? Tell me about the mysterious James Carver who makes indecent offers to strangers. 34. CEO, live in a penthouse that could probably fit your entire building, and apparently have the bad habit of turning misunderstandings into opportunities. CEO of what? Boring things that make a lot of money. Sophie laughed out loud, earning curious looks from passers-by. There was humor behind his arrogance, a self-awareness that made his confidence more palatable. Are you always this evasive? Are you always this curious? Touché. Her phone buzzed with a call. Ethan. For the first time in hours, she hesitated before answering. Hi, she said, her voice sounding strangely guilty. Sophie, sorry I didn't respond to your message earlier. I had meetings all day. How about dinner tonight? I can be at your place in an hour. She looked at the phone in her hand at the conversation with James Carver still open on the screen. Actually, Ethan, I don't think I can tonight. I'm tired. There was a pause. Everything okay? You sound different. I'm fine. I just need a night to myself. After she hung up, she stared at the phone for a long moment. A new message from James Carver was blinking on the screen. Still there? Still here. Good. I was starting to get bored again. And that would be terrible, wouldn't it? Devastating. Sophie smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. The thrill of discovery, of the unknown. James Carver was arrogant, controlling, and probably dangerous to her peace of mind, but he was also intelligent, provocative, and completely different from any man she'd ever met. James Carver. Yes. This conversation, where is it going? There was a long pause before the response came. Wherever you want it to go, Sophie, but something tells me you've already decided. She stared at the words on the screen, her heart beating faster. He was right. Somehow, in just a few hours, James Carver had awakened a curiosity in her that was impossible to ignore, and the scariest part? She didn't want to ignore it. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed her response, knowing she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. 3 days had passed since Sophie had typed her last response to James Carver, a response she never sent. Her hands had trembled so much that she ended up closing the app and promising herself she wouldn't open it again. But promises made to oneself were the easiest ones to break. She was organizing a new shipment of dresses when her phone rang, not a text, a call, unknown number. Her heart raced because somehow she knew who it was. Hello? Her voice came out more hesitant than she intended. Sophie. The voice was deep, controlled, with an accent that suggested expensive education and power. James Carver. How did you get my number? I have resources and patience. You disappeared in the middle of an interesting conversation. Sophie stepped away from the counter, walking to the boutique window. Outside, Brooklyn continued its familiar rhythm, but inside her head, everything had changed since that deep voice had spoken her name. I didn't disappear. I made a sensible decision. Sensible is a boring word, and you clearly have issues with boredom. She heard him laugh, a low, rich sound that made something tighten in her stomach. Meet me for dinner tonight. Absolutely not. Why? Because you're a stranger who makes inappropriate offers and apparently gets phone numbers from people who didn't give them to you. Touché. But you're curious about me. If you weren't, you would have blocked my number 3 days ago. Sophie closed her eyes, hating that he was right. James Carver, The Riverside, 8. If you don't show up, I promise never to bother you again. The call ended before she could respond. Sophie stared at the phone, torn between frustration and an excitement she didn't want to admit. The Riverside was one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, the kind of place that appeared in luxury magazines and where a glass of wine cost more than she made. In a day, James Carver adjusted his shirt cuffs for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt nervous before a date, nervous about anything, really. His life was built on certainties, but Sophie Bennett had become a beautiful uncertainty. At 8:15, he was beginning to accept that she wouldn't come when he saw her. Sophie entered the Riverside like she was invading a world she didn't belong to, which James Carver realized was exactly the case. She wore a simple black dress that had probably cost less than the tip he'd give the waiter. But there was a natural elegance about her that made the jewelry-laden women at other tables seem overdone. You came, he said, standing as she approached, against my better judgment. Sophie sat down, her eyes taking in the opulent surroundings. This place is a lot. You get used to it. I'm not sure I want to get used to it. James Carver studied her face, the way she held her shoulders slightly tense, how her eyes avoided meeting his directly. You're nervous. I'm not nervous. I'm cautious. There's a difference. What's the difference? Nervous implies I care what you think of me. Cautious means I know I should run. James Carver smiled. And why aren't you running? Sophie finally met his eyes. I'm still deciding. The dinner unfolded like a careful dance, each testing the other's boundaries, advancing and retreating in a rhythm that was part seduction, part negotiation. James Carver discovered that Sophie was smarter than he'd expected, more challenging, too. She wasn't impressed by his money or power, and that was refreshing. Why did you really ask me here? Sophie asked when they were on dessert that she'd barely touched. Business proposal. Ah, we're back to that. James Carver leaned forward, his voice lowering. 3 months. 10,000 a month. You accompany me to social events, dinners, some trips, nothing more. Sophie nearly choked on her wine. Are you serious? Completely. Why would I do that? Because you need money, and I need companionship that doesn't come with ulterior motives. How do you know I need money? James Carver hesitated. He'd investigated Sophie, found out about the rented apartment, the boutique job, her mother's medical bills, but something about the vulnerability in her eyes stopped him from revealing how deep he'd dug. Intuition. He lied. Sophie laughed. But there was no humor in the sound. $30,000 to pretend to like you for 3 months? To accompany me? Liking me is optional. She stood up abruptly. Thank you for dinner. James Carver. But I'm not for sale. He watched her head for the door, part of him admiring her dignity, part wondering if he'd miscalculated. But when she reached the door, her phone rang. She looked at the screen, and he saw her face go pale. Sophie answered, walking outside the restaurant. James Carver couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw through the glass window the exact moment her shoulders collapsed, when she leaned against the wall as if the world had crashed down on her. When she came back, her eyes were red but dry. My mother, she said simply, the cancer has spread. There's an experimental treatment, but insurance won't cover it. $15,000. James Carver said nothing, just waited. $15,000 a month, Sophie said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. 6 months. And for the first 2 weeks, you don't touch me, not even a handshake. Done. And if I decide I can't do it anymore, I can leave at any time. James Carver extended his hand. Done. Sophie looked at his hand for a long moment before shaking it. The touch was brief, professional. But James Carver felt something like electricity run through his skin. This isn't about you or me, Sophie said. Her words more to herself than to him. This is about my mother. Of course, James Carver agreed, but they both knew she was lying. As he watched Sophie sign the contract his lawyer had prepared in record time, James Carver wondered if he was buying her companionship or if he'd just made the most dangerous deal of his life. A week later, Sophie found herself in the mirror of a Bergdorf Goodman fitting room, staring at a version of herself she barely recognized. The navy silk dress cost more than her income for 3 months. The personal shopper James Carver had hired circled around her like an artist perfecting her masterpiece. Perfect for tonight's charity dinner, the woman murmured, adjusting an invisible pleat. Mr. Carver has impeccable taste. Sophie bit her tongue to keep from responding that James Carver hadn't chosen the dress. He'd simply given her a spending limit that made her dizzy. Over the past weeks, she'd been measured, fitted, styled, and taught social etiquette like a doll being prepared for a show. Her phone buzzed. A message from James Carver. The driver will be there in 20 minutes. Are you ready? Define ready, she typed back. To face 50 of the most powerful men in New York, while pretending I belong in your world? Sure, the response came quickly. You don't need to pretend anything. Just be yourself. Sophie laughed bitterly. Easy for him to say. James Carver had been born into this world. For her, every event was like performing in a foreign language. The car that picked her up wasn't just a car, it was a statement on wheels. Sophie sank into the soft leather, trying not to calculate how many months of rent that seat cost. When they arrived at the Plaza Hotel, James Carver was waiting at the entrance, stunning in a tuxedo that seemed to have been made specifically for him. You look beautiful, he said, offering his arm. You seem surprised. I'm always surprised when someone exceeds my expectations. Sophie took his arm, pretending not to notice how the touch sent small shocks through her skin. And your expectations for me were low. My expectations for everyone are low. It's safer that way. The ballroom was a sea of expensive gowns and tuxedos under crystal chandeliers. Sophie recognized faces from magazines, politicians, actors, heirs to fortunes. And there she was, a boutique saleswoman from Brooklyn, walking among them as if she had the right to be there. Relax, James Carver murmured in her ear, his hand resting lightly on her back. You're wound tight as a spring. It's easy to relax when this is your natural habitat. This was never my natural habitat, Sophie. I just learned how to navigate it. She looked at him, surprised by the honesty. What do you mean? But before James Carver could answer, an older man approached, some senator from what Sophie remembered of the briefing James Carver had given her. James Carver? And this must be Sophie we've heard so much about. Sophie smiled politely. But inside, she wondered what exactly James Carver had said about her, and to whom. It's a pleasure to meet you, Senator. The pleasure is mine. James Carver told us you work in vintage fashion preservation. Fascinating field. Sophie blinked. Vintage fashion preservation? She opened her mouth to correct him, but felt James Carver's hand gently squeeze her waist, a silent warning. It's a passion, she managed to say. The night continued like this. James Carver weaving an elaborate web of half-truths about Sophie's background, transforming her real life into something palatable for this audience. She was the independent curator, the fashion sustainability specialist, the young entrepreneur, with a unique market vision. During dinner, seated between a federal judge and an oil magnate's wife, Sophie found herself not just surviving, but actually participating in conversations. Her opinions on urban gentrification were heard with interest. Her observations on social inequality sparked animated discussions. "You're quite a surprise," said Mrs. Reynolds, the magnate's wife. "James Carver usually brings companions who are more decorative." Sophie nearly choked on her wine. "Other companions? Oh dear, you didn't know. Our James Carver collects beautiful women like works of art. Admirable for a while, then replaced by newer models." Sophie felt something cold settle in her stomach. She looked across the table at James Carver, who was absorbed in a conversation about corporate mergers, apparently oblivious to the bomb that had just exploded in her world. In the car heading home, the silence was deafening. James Carver tried several times to start conversations, but Sophie responded in monosyllables, staring out the window as if Manhattan were the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. "Are you going to tell me what's wrong? Or are we going to pretend this silence is comfortable?" he finally asked. "Other companions? James Carver? How many women went through this same process before me?" James Carver sighed. "Sophie, how many?" she repeated, turning to face him. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." James Carver was quiet for a long moment. "3, maybe 4. Never anything like this." "Like what?" "Never for 6 months. Never with complications." "Complications." James Carver stared at her, and Sophie saw something in his eyes she couldn't name. "You, Sophie, you're the complication." The car stopped in front of Sophie's building. She opened the door but hesitated. "That story about vintage fashion preservation. You work in a boutique. You take care of clothes. It wasn't technically a lie. It was a complete reinvention of my reality. Welcome to my world. Here, reality is negotiable." Sophie got out of the car, but leaned down to look at him one last time. "What if I don't want my reality to be negotiable?" James Carver didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, less controlled. "Then maybe you're the one who's going to teach me something new." As Sophie climbed to her apartment, she wondered if James Carver was proving to be a more complex teacher than she'd imagined. And the most frightening question of all, was she starting to enjoy the lessons? Palm Beach at sunset was like a painting done in shades of gold and coral. Sophie stood on the presidential suite's balcony, watching the ocean stretch endlessly before her, when she felt James Carver approaching. 3 weeks had passed since the charity dinner, 3 weeks of social events, trips, and a growing tension that threatened to consume them. The gala was a success, James Carver said, stopping beside her. His tie was undone, the first buttons of his shirt open, and Sophie had to force herself not to look at the exposed skin. "Define success," she replied, not taking her eyes off the horizon. "If it's by the amount of money raised for charity, then yes. If it's by the number of times I had to pretend the mayor's jokes were funny, it was a total disaster." James Carver laughed, that low sound that always made something tighten in Sophie's chest. "You were perfect, as always. Perfect." Sophie turned to face him. "Is that what you want? Programmed perfection? I want you." The words came out so simple, so direct, that Sophie felt the air escape from her lungs. For weeks, they'd been dancing around this attraction, maintaining a respectful distance, following the contract's rules. But here, with the sound of waves drowning out the rest of the world, the rules seemed distant and irrelevant. "James Carver," she began, but he took a step forward, closing the space between them. 3 weeks, Sophie. 3 weeks watching you, listening to you, discovering how your mind works. And the only thing I've been able to conclude is that you've left me completely lost." Sophie felt her heart race. "We have an agreement. Rules that I made because I thought it would be easier that way." James Carver raised his hand, hesitating for a moment before gently touching her face. "But there's nothing easy about you, Sophie Bennett." The touch was gentle, almost reverent, and Sophie found herself leaning into it despite herself. "This is going to complicate everything. It's already complicated." And then he kissed her. It was different from any kiss Sophie had ever experienced. James Carver started slowly, almost cautiously, as if she might break or disappear. But when Sophie responded, when her hands gripped the front of his shirt and she allowed herself to be pulled against him, the kiss deepened, James Carver kissed her as if he were trying to memorize her taste, as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. Sophie lost herself in him, in the scent of his cologne mixed with sea salt, in the way his hands tangled in her hair, in how he murmured her name against her lips. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. James Carver rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Sophie," he whispered, and there was something almost vulnerable in the way he said her name. "I know," she replied, because she understood. What was happening between them had crossed the boundaries of the contract, had become something real and frightening and impossible to ignore. James Carver opened his eyes, and Sophie saw something in them she'd never seen before. Uncertainty. "Where does this leave us?" Before Sophie could answer, he kissed her again. This time with more urgency, his hands found the bare skin of her back through her dress's neckline, and Sophie felt every nerve ending catch fire. She pressed against him, lost in the sensation, in the desire that had been building for weeks. James Carver's hands traced her waist, moved down to her hips, and Sophie moaned softly against his lips. It was too much and not enough at the same time. She wanted more, wanted everything, wanted to forget there were rules or reasons or anything besides this moment. But when James Carver began to pull down her dress's zipper, reality hit her like ice water. "Stop," she whispered, placing her hands on his chest. James Carver froze immediately, his hands stopping where they were. "Sophie, I can't." She stepped away, adjusting her dress with trembling hands. "Not like this, not yet." James Carver ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to control himself. "I didn't mean to pressure. You didn't pressure me. It's just—" Sophie turned back to the ocean, hugging herself. "If we do this, it changes everything, and I don't know if I'm ready for everything to change." James Carver moved closer, but kept his distance, respecting the space she'd created. "What do you want, Sophie?" "Time," she said finally. "I need time to understand what this means." "How much time?" "I don't know." James Carver was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was more controlled, but there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before. "That's okay. You're worth the wait, Sophie, however long it takes." Sophie turned to look at him, surprised by the patience in his voice. This was the man who controlled empires, who turned decisions into millions, who never waited for anything. And yet, there he was, willing to wait for her. "James Carver." "Yes. What you said about wanting me, did you mean it?" James Carver approached slowly, stopping only when he was close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. Every word. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to process the intensity of what she was feeling. When she opened them again, James Carver was still there, looking at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Does this scare you?" she asked. James Carver considered the question seriously. "It should, but strangely it doesn't. You make me want things I never thought I wanted." "Like what?" "Like a future I can't completely control." The night breeze brought the sound of waves and the smell of the sea, wrapping them in a bubble of intimacy. Sophie knew she'd crossed a line today, not just physically, but emotionally. James Carver was no longer just a contract or a solution to her mother's problems. He was becoming something much more dangerous. He was becoming important, and as she watched him, seeing how the moonlight highlighted the contours of his face, Sophie wondered if it was already too late to protect her heart. The Hope Foundation Ball was the most prestigious event on Manhattan's social calendar, a night when high society gathered to display their generosity and secretly judge one another. Sophie was getting ready in the mirror of James Carver's suite bathroom, adjusting the borrowed diamonds that sparkled against her skin like captured stars. 2 weeks had passed since Palm Beach, 2 weeks of delicious and torturous tension, where every glance lasted a second too long, every accidental touch sent electric shocks, and every good night ended with both of them fighting the urge to break down the barriers Sophie had established. "Are you ready?" James Carver appeared behind her in the mirror, stunning in the black tuxedo that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "As ready as someone can be to face 300 people who probably make in an hour what I make in a year," Sophie replied, turning to face him. James Carver studied her with that intense look she'd learned to recognize, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. "You look beautiful. You always say that because it's always true." Sophie felt the familiar warmth rise up her neck. Even after weeks, James Carver still managed to make her feel like a teenager with her first crush. "James Carver," she began, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Mr. Carver, the car is waiting," came the driver's voice, The plaza's grand ballroom was transformed into an adult fairy tale crystal chandeliers, reflecting golden light over women in dresses that cost more than cars, and men whose watches were worth more than houses. Sophie recognized faces from society pages, CEOs of major corporations, even some Hollywood actors. Breathe, James Carver murmured in her ear as they walked through the crowd. You belong here as much as any of them. Charming liar, she whispered back, but smiled despite herself. They were talking with a group of philanthropists when Sophie saw her for the first time. A woman who made all the others seem ordinary by comparison tall, with platinum blonde hair pulled into an elegant chignon. She wore a red silk dress that seemed to have been painted on her perfect body, and she was looking directly at James Carver as if he were her personal property. Sophie felt something cold settle in her stomach as the woman began approaching, her walk a calculated display of confidence and power. James Carver, the voice was smooth as honey, with an accent that suggested European education. What a delightful surprise. James Carver stiffened beside Sophie, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on her waist. Victoria, aren't you going to introduce me to your companion? Victoria's eyes slid over Sophie with the precision of a scanner, cataloging and judging every detail. Sophie Bennett, Victoria Langley, James Carver said, his voice carefully neutral. Ah, so you're James Carver's new acquisition. Victoria extended a perfectly manicured hand. Pleasure to meet you, dear. Sophie shook the offered hand, noting how Victoria's expensive rings pressed against her fingers. The pleasure is mine. Sophie works in vintage fashion preservation, James Carver said, and Sophie recognized the softened version of her life he'd created. How interesting. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her ice-blue eyes. James Carver has always been drawn to projects. The word projects was pronounced with such condescension that Sophie felt her cheeks burn. But before she could respond, James Carver intervened. If you'll excuse us, I need to greet Senator Peterson. As James Carver walked away, Sophie found herself alone with Victoria, who continued smiling that sharp smile. May I ask you a personal question, dear? Victoria didn't wait for an answer. How much is he paying you? Sophie felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Excuse me? Oh, don't play dumb. James Carver has a very specific pattern. Young, beautiful, needy women. He likes to be the savior, you know, makes him feel powerful. I don't know what you're talking about. Victoria laughed, a crystalline and cruel sound. Of course you do. Let me guess. You needed money for something important. Sick family, debts. James Carver appeared like a knight in shining armor, offering a solution. Sophie didn't respond, but her expression must have given everything away because Victoria's smile widened. I thought so. You know you're not the first, right? There was Rachel, daughter of a bankrupt broker. Lauren, trying to save the family farm. And Emily, oh, Emily was special. She lasted almost a year. Why are you telling me this? Because you seem sweet, and I don't like to see sweet women get hurt. James Carver gets bored quickly. When that happens, you'll be discarded like all the others. Sophie felt the world spin slightly. You're lying. Emmy? Victoria tilted her head. James Carver never mentioned we were once engaged, that I was part of this same arrangement 3 years ago. The difference is, I was smart enough to belong in his world. If you were engaged, why didn't you get married? Victoria's smile faltered for just a second. Because I discovered he was paying other women, even while we were planning our wedding. James Carver collects people, dear, especially broken people he can fix. Sophie looked across the ballroom to where James Carver was talking with a group of older men. He looked so controlled, so in command, exactly like the first day they'd met. Had it all been an elaborate performance? You're wondering if any of it was real, aren't you? Victoria followed her gaze. Let me save you the trouble of finding out. It wasn't to James Carver. You're just the latest in a long line of charity projects. Sophie excused herself and ran to the bathroom. Her vision blurred by tears she refused to shed in public. In the mirror, she saw what Victoria had seen. A woman out of place, wearing borrowed diamonds and pretending to belong to a world that would never be hers. When she came out of the bathroom, 15 minutes later, James Carver had disappeared. Sophie searched for him in the ballroom, but he was nowhere to be found. A waiter told her he'd seen Mr. Carver leave a few minutes earlier. Sophie grabbed her phone, typing a quick message. Not feeling well. Going home. She didn't wait for a response. She couldn't face James Carver now, not when every word from Victoria echoed in her head. not when she was beginning to question whether everything she'd started to believe was a carefully constructed lie. As the taxi took her back to Brooklyn, Sophie looked out the window at Manhattan's lights, growing distant. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again, small, ordinary, and terribly alone. James Carver found Victoria on the plaza's terrace, smoking a cigarette with the same calculated elegance with which she did everything. The rage that had been boiling inside him since he discovered Sophie had disappeared finally overflowed. "What the hell did you say to her?" Victoria turned slowly, a satisfied smile playing on her red lips. "James Carver, darling, you look disturbed." Sophie ran out of here like she'd seen a ghost. "And I have the feeling that ghost has your face. I just clarified a few things for the girl about your history with young, needy women." James Carver stepped forward, his voice dangerously low. "What history, Victoria?" "Oh, please, Rachel Morrison, Lauren Chen, Emily Davis. Should I continue?" Victoria took a theatrical drag. "All young, all broken, all paid by you to be your company, until you got bored and moved on to the next one. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Victoria laughed a cutting sound. "I was your fiancé, James Carver. I saw how you operated even then, always needing to be the savior, always collecting damaged people to fix." James Carver felt a cold fury take hold of him. "The difference between you and Sophie is that Sophie never needed to be fixed. She was already perfect." Victoria's smile faltered. "How romantic and completely false. You're jealous." "Jealous?" Victoria threw the cigarette away forcefully. "Of a boutique saleswoman? Please, jealous because she achieved something you never could. Making me feel something real." The words came out before James Carver could stop them. But the moment he said them, he knew they were true. Sophie had done something no woman before her had managed. She'd broken down his defenses, without even trying. "Go to hell, James Carver. I'm already there," he replied, running off. James Carver spent the next 2 days looking for Sophie. She didn't answer his calls, wouldn't open her apartment door, and when he went to the boutique, Mrs. Lynn said she'd asked for a few days off. It was Clara, his assistant, who finally found him in the office at 2:00 the morning on the third day, surrounded by crumpled papers and several cups of cold coffee. "Mr. Carver, Miss Bennett, is at Mount Sinai Hospital. Oncology wing." James Carver couldn't remember ever running so fast in his life. Sophie was sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the hospital corridor. Her eyes red and swollen from crying. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, the first time James Carver had seen her without the expensive dresses and borrowed jewelry that had become her armor in that strange world. She looked up when she heard him approaching, and James Carver saw something break in her expression. "How did you find me?" "It doesn't matter." James Carver knelt in front of her chair, not caring about the curious looks from passing medical staff. "Sophie, about what Victoria said, was it true?" Sophie's voice was hoarse from crying. "About the other women?" James Carver closed his eyes. "Yes and no. That's not an answer, James Carver. Yes, there were other women. Yes, I helped them financially. No, it was never like this." He opened his eyes, meeting hers. "I never cared about any of them, Sophie. They were transactions, business, and me? Am I just another business deal? You were." The words hurt to say, but he continued. "At first you were, but somewhere between your first sarcastic response and the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, you became so much more." Sophie shook her head. "I can't do this anymore, James Carver. I can't keep pretending I belong in your world." "Then don't pretend." "What?" James Carver took her hands, noticing how cold and trembling they were. "Forget the contract. Forget the social events and expensive clothes and all that crap. Stay with me because you want to, not because you're being paid to." Sophie looked at him as if he'd gone insane. "James Carver, I love you." The words fell between them like bombs, echoing through the hospital corridor. James Carver had never said those words to anyone, not to Victoria, not to any of the others. But there, kneeling on the cold hospital floor, they seemed to be the only truth that mattered. "No," Sophie whispered, tears beginning to fall again. "You can't say that now." "Why not?" "Because my mother is dying." The word came out like a muffled scream. "The doctors said the treatment isn't working. She has maybe weeks, not months." James Carver felt the world stop. "Sophie, and I fell in love with you." The words came out between sobs. "Even knowing it was stupid, even knowing we were from different worlds, I fell in love with you. And now I don't know if any of it was real." James Carver raised his hands to frame her face. his thumbs wiping away the tears. "This is real. What I feel for you is real. The rest we can figure out together." "How?" "Marry me." Sophie stopped crying, staring at him as if he were a stranger. "What?" "Marry me not as part of a contract or an agreement. Marry me, because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "James Carver, you're crazy." "Probably." He smiled through his own tears. "But I'm crazy in love with you, Sophie Bennett. And if you give me a chance, a real chance, not a contract, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that this is true." A nurse appeared in the corridor. "Miss Bennett, your mother is awake and asking for you." Sophie stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hands. I need to go." "I know." She hesitated, looking at him. "James Carver." "Yes. Give me time to think. However much time you need." As Sophie disappeared down the corridor toward her mother's room, James Carver remained kneeling on the cold floor, realizing that for the first time in his adult life, his future was completely out of his control, and strangely, it didn't scare him as much as it should have, because for the first time, he'd found someone who was worth more than any power or control he could wield. A week passed in strange limbo. James Carver respected Sophie's request for space, but every day he sent flowers to the hospital, not extravagant arrangements that screamed money, but simple daisies that he remembered her mentioning were her mother's favorites. Sophie spent her days in room 314, watching her mother fight a battle they both knew she was losing. Ellen Bennett had always been a small woman, but now she seemed fragile as paper, her eyes still bright with the intelligence and love that had guided Sophie throughout her life. "Are you going to tell me about him? Or are we going to keep pretending those flowers magically appear every day?" Ellen asked on a Thursday afternoon, her voice weak but still with that motherly tone that didn't accept lies. Sophie looked up from the book she was pretending to read. "Mom, Sophie Catherine Bennett, I have cancer. I'm not blind, and I'm definitely not stupid." Ellen pointed to the fresh daisies on the windowsill. "Those flowers cost a fortune to have every day, and you've been walking around looking like you lost your best friend and won $1 million at the same time." Sophie sighed, closing the book. "It's complicated. The best things usually are, he asked me to marry him." Ellen tried to sit up straighter in bed. And I don't know what to do." "Do you love him?" The simple question hit Sophie like a punch. "Does that matter, honey?" "It's the only thing that matters." Sophie stood up, walking to the window. "Yes, I love him more than I thought it was possible to love someone. But you're scared. We're from completely different worlds, Mom. He's James Carver, CEO, millionaire. A man who dines with senators and has more money than I can imagine. And I'm me." Ellen was quiet for a moment. "Can I meet him?" "Mom, Sophie, if my daughter is going to marry a man, I want to meet him before I die." The word die still made Sophie flinch, but she nodded. "I'll call him." James Carver arrived 2 hours later, carrying not flowers, but a small potted lavender plant. Sophie watched from the doorway as he approached her mother's bed, his usual confidence replaced by something resembling nervousness. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice gentler than Sophie had ever heard. "I'm James Carver, the man who's been filling my room with flowers," Ellen replied. But she was smiling. "And who made my daughter look like she was struck by lightning?" James Carver smiled back. "Guilty on both counts." "Sit down," Ellen ordered, pointing to the chair beside the bed. "I want to meet the man who won my Sophie's heart." What followed was one of the most surreal conversations of Sophie's life. Her mother, who had never known anything beyond Brooklyn's working class, talked with James Carver as if they were old friends. She asked about his work, his family, his plans for the future, and James Carver responded with an honesty Sophie had never seen in him. "Can I ask you a personal question, James Carver?" Ellen asked after an hour. "Of course. Why my daughter?" James Carver looked at Sophie, then back at Ellen. "Because she made me want to be a better man. Because when she laughed at my bad jokes, I felt like I had conquered the world. Because she's brave and smart, and has a heart big enough to love, even when she should protect herself." "And do you love her?" "More than my own life." Ellen nodded slowly. "Good answer." She extended her thin hand, taking James Carver's. "But let me be clear about one thing." "Yes, ma'am." "If you hurt my daughter, if you make her feel like she's not good enough for you for even 1 second, I will come back from the grave and haunt you for the rest of your miserable life." James Carver laughed gently, squeezing her hand. "I accept those terms. And one more thing. Whatever you need." Ellen looked directly into his eyes. "Never let fear win over love. Promise me that." "I promise." That night, Sophie walked with James Carver to the hospital parking lot. The silence between them was loaded with everything they hadn't said. "Your mother is incredible," James Carver said finally. "She liked you. That's rare, Sophie." James Carver stopped walking, turning to face her. "What your mother said about not letting fear win over love, she was talking to me. But I think she was also talking to you." Sophie felt tears burn her eyes. "James Carver, marry me." This time, his voice was steady, without the desperation from a week ago. "Not because you need the money. Not because it's part of some contract. Marry me because you love me. What if it doesn't work out? What if we find out we're too incompatible? What if it does work out?" James Carver took her hands. "What if we find out we're exactly what each other needs?" Sophie looked at him, really looked. She saw the man who had shown up at the hospital uninvited, who had knelt on the cold floor to declare his love, who had talked with her dying mother with kindness and respect. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." James Carver kissed her right there in the hospital parking lot, under the fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant, and Sophie thought she'd never been in a more perfect place. 3 days later, James Carver returned to the hospital. This time, he knelt beside Ellen's bed, not Sophie's. "Mrs. Bennett, I'd like to ask for your blessing to marry your daughter." Ellen smiled, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "You have my blessing, son, and my gratitude. You'll take care of her when I can't anymore." "With my life," James Carver promised. "Good answer," Ellen repeated. But this time, her words came out as a whisper. Sophie watched from the doorway, knowing she was witnessing something sacred, the passing from one generation to the next, love being transferred from one form to another. And when James Carver stood up and extended his hand to her, Sophie knew she was ready for what came next. The fear was still there, but love was bigger. Love would always be bigger. 3 months had passed since Ellen Bennett had closed her eyes for the last time, holding Sophie's hand with one of hers and James Carver's with the other. The funeral had been simple, as she'd asked garden flowers instead of expensive arrangements, shared stories instead of formal speeches, and the kind of genuine love that no amount of money could buy. Now Sophie stood on the terrace of the mansion in Alpharetta, Georgia, watching the morning sun filter through the garden trees. James Carver's house was different from what she'd expected. Not the cold fortress of glass and steel she'd imagined, but an old brick construction with wild gardens and cozy corners that seemed made to embrace whoever lived there. "Coffee." James Carver appeared behind her, 2 steaming cups in his hands. "Thank you." Sophie accepted the cup, noticing how he still seemed slightly surprised to find her there every morning, as if he still couldn't believe she'd chosen to stay. They'd gotten married 2 weeks after Ellen's death in a small ceremony at a church in Connecticut. It hadn't been the fairy tale wedding that society magazines expected. Sophie had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered by a local seamstress, and James Carver had cried when she walked down the aisle to the sound of an out-of-tune organ. "How are you feeling about today?" James Carver asked, sitting in the chair next to hers. Today was the official opening day of Sophie's boutique, Vintage Ray, in downtown Alpharetta. James Carver had insisted on financing the project, but Sophie had been firm. It would be a loan with market-rate interest and a proper payment plan. She wanted to build something of her own, not have something given to her. Nervous, excited, scared that nobody will show up. Sophie smiled over the rim of her cup. "The usual opening day feelings, I imagine. You're going to kill it. You have to say that, 'You're my husband.'" "I say that because it's true." James Carver took her free hand. "Sophie, in the past months, I've watched you transform an empty space into a work of art. I've watched you win over the trust of women who'd never heard of you. You're going to kill it because that's who you are." Sophie felt that familiar wave of warmth that always came when James Carver looked at her that way, as if she were the most precious thing in his world. James Carver. "Yeah, I'm happy." The words were simple, but James Carver smiled as if she'd given him the world. "Me, too." The morning passed in a rush of last-minute preparations. Sophie was adjusting a mannequin when she felt a strange wave of dizziness. She leaned against the wall, waiting for it to pass. But instead her stomach lurched violently. She barely made it to the bathroom in time. "Sophie." Her assistant, Mia's voice came from the other side of the door. "Are you okay?" I'm fine," Sophie managed to answer, though she clearly wasn't. Must be nerves. But when it happened again an hour later, and then once more when James Carver arrived for lunch, Sophie began to suspect it wasn't nerves. "You look pale," James Carver observed, touching her forehead. "Maybe we should cancel the opening." "Absolutely not." Sophie pulled away from his hand. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. All afternoon, waves of nausea hit her at random moments. When she finally sent Mia home and closed the boutique, Sophie drove straight to the pharmacy. 3 tests, all positive. Sophie stared at the 2 pink lines on the last test, her mind completely blank. Pregnant. She was pregnant. She and James Carver had talked about children in abstract terms, someday in the future, when they were more established, when they had more time, but someday had become today, and Sophie didn't know how she felt about it. She drove home on autopilot, the tests hidden in her purse like small bombs waiting to explode their carefully constructed life. James Carver was in the kitchen when she arrived, preparing dinner with the concentration he applied to everything in his life. He'd become a surprisingly good cook in recent months, discovering that he enjoyed the precision and creativity it required. "How was the rest of the afternoon?" he asked without turning from the stove. It was good." Sophie dropped her purse on the kitchen table, the tests practically burning a hole through the leather. James Carver. I need to tell you something." Something in her voice made him turn around completely. "What is it?" Sophie pulled one of the tests from her purse, placing it on the table between them. "I'm pregnant." James Carver stared at the small plastic device for a long moment, as if it were a puzzle he needed to decipher. Then he looked at Sophie, and she saw something she hadn't expected in his eyes. Pure joy. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I know we didn't plan this. I know it's too early." I know that James Carver crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, taking Sophie in his arms and spinning her through the air. "We're having a baby. James Carver, put me down before I throw up on you." Sophie laughed despite herself. He set her down gently, but kept his hands on her waist. "Sorry, it's just Sophie. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy? Happy?" James Carver laughed, a rich and genuine sound. "Sophie, I'm beyond happy. There's no word for what I'm feeling." Sophie felt tears burn her eyes. Tears of relief, of joy, of overflowing love. "So, you want this? You want to have a family with me?" "I want everything with you." James Carver framed her face with his hands. "I want to build a life with you, have children with you, grow old with you. I want to wake up every day for the next 50 years knowing that you're mine." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, as if she was something sacred. And Sophie thought maybe she was the 2 of them together, creating life, building a future that neither of them had imagined possible just a few months before. "I'm scared," she whispered against his lips. "Me, too. But we'll be scared together." Sophie laughed through her tears. "That's not very comforting." "Then let me try again." James Carver rested his forehead against hers. "Sophie Carver, you're going to be an incredible mother, and I'm going to do everything in my power to be the kind of father our child deserves." "Sophie Carver," she repeated, smiling. "I'm still getting used to that. We have the rest of our lives for you to get used to it." As they stood there in the kitchen, embracing in the golden light of sunset, Sophie felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of completeness she'd never experienced. They'd started as strangers, brought together by a misunderstanding, but somehow they'd become a family, and now, with new life growing inside her, Sophie finally understood what her mother had meant about never letting fear win over love. 6 months later, Sophie sat on the mansion's terrace, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching James Carver teach her mother, who had miraculously recovered and now visited once a month, how to make her famous vegetarian lasagna. The scene was so domestically perfect that sometimes Sophie had to pinch herself to make sure it was real. "No, James Carver, you're putting too much cheese." Her mother's voice floated through the open kitchen window. "Mom, there's no such thing as too much cheese when it comes to lasagna," James Carver replied, and Sophie smiled, hearing the genuine affection in his voice when he called her mom. Ellen's miraculous recovery had been as unexpected as it was complete. The doctors couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the new experimental treatment. Maybe it was the happiness of seeing her daughter married and pregnant. Or maybe it was simply the power of love being stronger than any medical diagnosis. "Sophie, dear, come help us before your husband ruins my recipe," Ellen shouted from inside the house. Sophie stood up slowly, her hands supporting her aching back. At 7 months pregnant, she'd developed a new appreciation for the phrase "big as a house," but James Carver seemed to find her more beautiful every day. In the kitchen, she found the familiar scene. James Carver covered in flour up to his elbows, trying to follow her mother's meticulous instructions, who supervised every movement with the intensity of a general commanding troops. "You know he runs $1 billion company, right?" Sophie said to her mother, kissing her cheek. "Running a company and making lasagna are completely different skills," Ellen replied seriously. "One requires logic, The other requires soul. James Carver rolled his eyes, but was smiling. Your mother is a culinary tyrant, and you love it. Sophie shot back, stealing a piece of cheese from the bowl. I hate to admit it, but yes, they worked together in the kitchen, three people who had become a family in ways none of them had planned. Sophie watched James Carver and her mother argue about the proper amount of seasoning and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. Later that night, after Ellen had gone to the guest room and the lasagna had been devoured with appropriate praise, Sophie and James Carver were back on the terrace. The night was warm and scented with jasmine from the garden, and stars dotted the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. "Remember when you said I was a complication?" Sophie asked, settling against James Carver's chest on the double chaise lounge they'd bought specifically for these nights. James Carver ran his fingers through her hair. "The best complication I ever had. Our daughter is going to be even more complicated. She's going to be perfect." "How are you so sure it's a girl?" "Male intuition." Sophie laughed. "That's not a real thing." "Yes, it is. And she's going to be exactly like you. Stubborn, smart, and completely capable of driving me crazy with love." Sophie turned her head to look at him. "Do you really think we're going to make it? That we'll be good parents?" James Carver was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know if we'll be good parents from day one, but I know we'll try with everything we have. And I know our daughter will grow up knowing she's loved." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I look at you and see the kind of woman who sacrificed for her mother, who built a life from scratch, who had the courage to love a stubborn man like me. If that woman is my daughter's mother, she'll grow up knowing she can conquer anything." Sophie felt familiar tears burn her eyes. Pregnancy had made her emotionally unstable, but this was different. This was pure love, manifesting in liquid form. "What if I told you I also think it's a girl? Then we're officially in trouble." James Carver laughed. "Why? Because two stubborn Carver women in the same house? I'm going to spend the rest of my life being outnumbered. And do you hate being outnumbered?" James Carver kissed the top of her head. "Sophie, before you, I controlled everything, every decision, every outcome, every variable. It was lonely, but it was safe. And now I wake up every day, not knowing exactly what to expect. You constantly surprise me, and in a few months, we're going to have a little person who will surprise us even more. It's terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Sophie settled deeper against him, feeling the baby kick against her ribs as if agreeing with the conversation. James Carver. "Yeah. Who would have thought it all started with a message sent to the wrong number?" James Carver was quiet for a moment, and Sophie felt his chest rise and fall with a deep breath. "It wasn't a mistake," he said finally, his voice low and full of conviction. "What do you mean?" "That message, that wrong number. The way everything unfolded, it wasn't a mistake, Sophie. It was destiny." Sophie turned in his arms so she could see him properly. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe some things are bigger than coincidence. I believe you were exactly what I needed at the exact moment I needed it, even though neither of us knew it at the time. What if I had never typed the wrong number? Then I'd still be sitting in my office controlling numbers on a spreadsheet, thinking that was living." James Carver gently touched her belly. "Instead of being here with my pregnant wife in my arms, waiting for our daughter to be born, with your mother in the house next door, making plans to spoil our daughter rotten." Sophie laughed through her tears. "She's definitely going to spoil her completely, and it's going to be wonderful." They fell silent for a moment, absorbing the simple perfection of the moment. The garden whispered around them. The night wrapped them like a blanket, and Sophie felt a deep peace settle in her bones. "Sophie." "Yeah. Thank you." "For what?" "For typing the wrong number. For being brave enough to answer my messages. For giving me a chance when I didn't deserve one. For teaching me that some things are more important than control." Sophie stretched up to kiss him a soft kiss, full of promises for the future. "Thank you for what?" "For answering." And there, under the Georgia stars, with her mother sleeping in the next room and her baby gently kicking inside her, Sophie knew James Carver was right. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been exactly what destiny had planned all along. Sometimes love arrives in the most unexpected way through a mistyped number, through a misunderstanding that transforms into perfect understanding. Sophie and James Carver discovered that destiny has its own plans, even when we think we're in control. A lost message became a life found, proving that the most beautiful mistakes are those that lead us exactly where we're supposed to be. And maybe, in the end, there are no wrong numbers, just connections waiting to happen.